Bonjour tout le monde and welcome to this video on conditional sentences in French. Now before we get started I want to make it clear that I will not be explaining the tenses used throughout this video. So if you're not already familiar with the present tense, the future, the imperfect, the conditional, the past perfect or the conditional perfect, then you need to familiarize yourself with those first because the focus of this video is very much the structure rather than the verb conjugations. Also, if you're not comfortable with these tenses, then you want to make sure that you master those first before you start using sentences such as these because they're a little bit more complex. Now, a lot of native English speakers struggle with conditional sentences, and I think it's because the topic as a whole is quite complicated. But the sentences themselves shouldn't be that difficult because a lot of the time they're exactly the same, if not very, very similar, in both English and French. So if you're struggling with French, it can be useful to use the English to help you. So let's start off by having a look at some of the types of conditional sentence that we have. We're going to focus on 3 in this video. There are more and we'll have a look at those towards the end, but these are the 3 most common and most important ones. So first of all, we have something like, if you work hard, you will succeed. So the implication here is that the person that we're talking to has not started to work yet, and we're telling them in the future when you do start working, if you work hard, you will succeed. Then we have something like, if you worked hard, you would succeed. So this time we're implying that the person has started to work, but they're not working hard, and so we're telling them, if you worked harder, do you know, actually, you would do a lot better. And finally, we have, if you had worked hard, you would have succeeded. So this time, the person has finished working, but at no point did they ever work hard, and thus, they didn't succeed. Now, if all this seems a little bit too complex, don't worry, we're going to have a look at each one in some more detail. Starting with the first one, which, strictly speaking, is known as the first conditional, but that kind of terminology isn't very helpful. For me, it's much easier to use a sentence to demonstrate what I'm talking about. And that sentence is, if you work hard, you will succeed. So what do we have in this English sentence? We have, if you work hard. That's the present tense. You will succeed. And the use of will is a big indicator of the future. So we have if plus present plus future. Now you notice I've put the if plus present part in brackets, and that's because we can switch things around. We can say you will succeed if you work hard. But we haven't just switched the tenses around. If we switch the tenses, it would be you succeed if you will work hard, which doesn't make any sense. Instead, we've switched the clauses, and each clause is if plus present, that's one, and then the future, that's the other. Okay, so we don't switch the tenses, we switch the clauses. So if in this type of sentence will always be followed by the present wherever it is in the sentence. Okay, so the structure of this one is future plus if plus present. I will say this many, many times throughout this video, so hopefully by the end it will be ingrained in your brain. Don't switch the tenses, switch the clauses. So what do we do in French? Well, it's exactly the same. Okay, we have si, which of course means if, plus présent, which is the present, plus futur, which is the future. So that sentence in French would be, si tu travailles dur, tu réussiras. Si tu travailles dur, tu réussiras. Si tu travailles dur, if you work hard, tu réussiras. You will succeed. Again, we can switch things around, so we have futur plus si plus présent, but remember we're not switching the tenses, we're switching the clauses, and so that would give us tu réussiras si tu travailles dur. Tu réussiras si tu travailles dur. You will succeed if you work hard. So then we move on to the imaginatively named second conditional, which is if you worked hard, you would succeed. And generally this is the one that people struggle with the most, but as I said before, it's not exactly the same as the English, but it's very, very similar in French. Okay, so what do we have in the English sentence? We have if you worked hard, so worked is the past, and you would succeed. Would in English is often an indicator of the conditional. It's not always, but in a conditional sentence, you might expect at some point to use the conditional. And so we have if plus past or past subjunctive plus present conditional. So the reason I've put / past subjunctive is because traditionally we use the past subjunctive in English in this type of sentence. But nowadays the past subjunctive and the past look exactly the same, with the exception of to be, and we'll look at an example of that later on, but for now we'll keep it simple and say past or past subjunctive, because some books and websites will say past, some of them will say past subjunctive. So if you know that it's possible that it could be both, then you're covered on all bases. All we need to remember is if, past, present conditional, okay? And of course we can switch things around. You would succeed if you worked hard. But again, what are we not doing? Switching the tenses. In fact, we are switching the clauses. So we have present conditional plus if plus past or past subjunctive. Don't worry about the whole past subjunctive thing, because in French, it's a lot simpler. Okay, it's different, but it's simpler. Instead, we have si plus imparfait plus conditionnel présent. So the only difference between the French and the English version of the second conditional is that instead of using the past after if, we use the imperfect. So this sentence would be si tu travaillais dur, tu réussirais. Si tu travaillais dur, if you worked hard, tu réussirais, you would succeed. As usual, we can switch this round, remembering to switch the clauses, not the tenses. So we have conditionnel présent plus si plus imparfait, which gives us tu réussirais si tu travaillais dur. Tu réussirais, you would succeed, si tu travaillais dur, if you worked hard. Now I'm going to let you in on a secret. Particularly on the internet, a lot of French people will use the conditional in both clauses. So they'll say, si tu travaillerais dur, tu réussirais. This is wrong. Completely wrong, okay? It's just an error that people make, as people make errors in English quite often. But this is not a generally accepted error, okay? It's not something that you can just do because other people do it. It is wrong, okay? In writing, in exams in particular, but also in speaking, it sounds weird. Okay, so if you see other people doing this, don't copy them because they're wrong, okay? Remember, it's si plus imparfait plus conditionnel présent. Then we move on to the third conditional, which was if you had worked hard, you would have succeeded. So what do we have here? If you had worked, that's the past perfect, or also known as the pluperfect. You would have succeeded. So this is the conditional perfect or the past conditional. There are different words for these things. So we have if plus past perfect plus conditional perfect. Okay, again, we can switch things around. You would have succeeded if you had worked hard, but we're switching the clauses, not the tenses. And so we have conditional perfect plus if plus past perfect. In French, this is basically exactly the same, and it's basically the past version of the second conditional. Okay, so it's all quite logical, really. We have si plus plus que parfait plus conditionnel passé. Okay, so the pluperfect is structured differently in English and French, but it's the same tense, right? So as long as you know which one's which, then it's pretty much the same thing. So si tu avais travaillé dur, tu aurais réussi. Si tu avais travaillé dur, if you had worked hard, tu aurais réussi. You would have succeeded. And I'm going to say it again, I know you're getting tired of it, but it's really important to remember, if you're going to switch things around, to switch clauses, not the tenses. Conditionnel passé plus si plus que parfait would also work, and that would give us tu aurais réussi si tu avais travaillé dur. Okay, so they're the three main ones, and hopefully that's made it a little bit clearer for you. We're now going to have a look at some other types of conditional sentence, and the reason I've not put these in the main body of the video is A, they're less common, and B, the translations are literally the same. Okay, so you can just think of these sentences as any other kind of sentence that you would translate. I don't like to say word for word, but basically word for word, okay? So for example, we have what is known in the world of linguistics as the zero conditional, And that's the type of sentence where we have something like, if you work hard, you succeed. Okay, so what we have here is the present followed by the present. And this generally is used to talk about a general truth, something that is true for everyone, not just a specific person. In English, we tend to use you to refer to people in general, but a better way of putting it would probably be, if one works hard, one succeeds. Okay, so it doesn't refer to anyone in particular, it's just general. And because of that, though the tenses are the same in French, I would use on to translate it. Si on travaille dur, on réussit. If one works hard, one succeeds. It sounds a little bit posh in English, but to use on in French is perfectly fine and is much more common. Then we have perhaps the most difficult one to explain. This is the fourth conditional, and this is this kind of sentence. If you had worked harder, you would be a doctor. So it's very similar to the third conditional, but the difference is in the tenses. So with the third conditional, we had, if you had worked hard, you would have succeeded. So both of those things happened in the past. They didn't work hard and they didn't succeed. Okay, so it's a past condition affecting the past. In the fourth conditional, as we have here, we have a past condition, if you had worked harder, affecting the present. You would be a doctor. So this person didn't work hard in the past and is currently not a doctor. Okay, and so what we have is the past perfect followed by the present conditional rather than the conditional perfect. Okay, if this is a little bit brain explodey for you, don't worry, because as I said before, the translation is basically the same thing. Okay, if you recognize had worked as the past perfect and would be as the conditional present, you're fine. Si tu avais travaillé plus dur, tu serais médecin. Si tu avais travaillé plus dur, if you had worked harder, tu serais médecin, you would be a doctor. Okay, so whether you understand the difference, whether you understand the whole tense thing, doesn't really matter. Okay, as long as you can recognize which tenses are being used in English, you can use the same tenses in French. Okay, so let's have a look at some more examples to hopefully make this a little bit clearer if it's still a bit difficult for you. So we start with, if we eat now, we won't be hungry later. So if we eat, present tense, we won't be hungry, future tense, later. Okay, so present future means first conditional. Okay, we've not actually eaten yet, but if we do, we're not going to be hungry later on. So, si on mange maintenant, on n'aura pas faim plus tard. Si on mange maintenant, on n'aura pas faim plus tard. So of course we're using the verb avoir rather than être here, because to be hungry in French is to have hunger, avoir faim. And of course we're using on mange, present tense, and on n'aura pas, future tense, just as we do in English. Then we have, if I were rich, I would buy a castle. Now remember at the start of this video when we were talking about the second conditional, we said that we can use the past or the past subjunctive, which in most cases looks exactly the same, okay? With the exception of to be, which in the past is was. I was rich, that means I used to be rich. But in this case we're using the past subjunctive or the imperfect subjunctive. Different people call it different things. So we're saying if I were rich, okay? So this is the one case where we do actually use the past subjunctive nowadays, and is the whole reason why I included the whole thing in the first place. But this doesn't matter because we're not learning English. In theory, we already know English, okay? So we can just learn that in French, instead of using the past or the past subjunctive, we use the imperfect, followed by the conditional just as it is in English. So we say, si j'étais riche, j'achèterais un château. Si j'étais riche, j'achèterais un château. Some people, as I said, particularly on the internet, will say, si je serais riche, j'achèterais un château, but that is wrong, incredibly wrong. I can't stress enough how wrong that is. Okay, si j'étais riche, j'achèterais un château. Then we have, if you had come with us, you would have had a good time, which in English is quite complex and it is quite complicated in French as well. So this would be, si tu étais venu avec nous, tu te serais amusé. Okay, so remember, venir and reflexive verbs such as s'amuser all use être in the compound tenses. These tenses are the past perfect and the conditional perfect, both of which are compound, i.e. they use an auxiliary verb and a past participle. Okay, and so because of that, we also need to think about agreement. In this case, we're using tu, so it's not clear whether we're talking to a man or a woman, hence I've put the e's in brackets. Now, this might be a little bit difficult for some of you, because it is quite complex. If it is, don't worry, use simpler sentences such as the ones above, okay? I've included this one just to show you the way some of these sentences can look, and for those of you who are maybe trying to push yourself a little bit further. If it makes no sense to you, don't worry, just ignore that one. Some people will look at this sentence and say, oh my goodness, the whole topic is really hard. No, it's just this sentence. Other sentences can be much, much simpler. And of course, we could switch all of these around, okay? Remembering not to switch the tenses, but to switch the clauses. So we could say, we won't be hungry later if we eat now. It's the same thing, just switched around. On n'aura pas faim plus tard si on mange maintenant. I would buy a castle if I were rich. J'achèterais un château si j'étais riche. Not j'achèterais un château si je serais riche. Incredibly wrong. And you would have had a good time if you had come with us. Tu te serais amusé si tu étais venu avec nous. And let's try some more. If we spend too much money, we won't be able to buy the house. Si on dépense trop d'argent, on ne pourra pas acheter la maison. Si on dépense trop d'argent, on ne pourra pas acheter la maison. Of course, for we, you could use nous instead. It's a little bit more formal, but why not? Si nous dépensons trop d'argent, nous ne pourrons pas acheter la maison. It's the same thing. They wouldn't know if we didn't tell them. Ils ne le sauraient pas si on ne leur disait pas. Okay. And he would have stayed if it hadn't started to rain. Il serait resté, why serait? Because rester takes être. Il serait resté s'il n'avait pas commencé à pleuvoir. Okay, so hopefully if you can look at those, spend some time with them, and hopefully it will become increasingly easier. As I said before, if these sentences are too difficult, come up with some of your own that are a lot simpler, okay? As I said, it's not the subject that's difficult, it's some of the sentences. So take out some of the elements, okay? Use verbs that take avoir if you have to. Don't use pronouns, object pronouns, for example, okay? Take them out. Say something that is a little bit simpler and work at your own pace, okay? These are just examples of different types of sentences at different levels of difficulty. Finally, if you want to do some more exciting activities with this, I highly recommend listening to the song Si j'étais président by Gérard Lenormand. I have to admit, it's incredibly 70s, which is funny because it was actually released in 1980. But hey, it's nearly the 70s. But it is a good song. I quite enjoy it. It has quite a lot of cultural references, but you can look them up and you'll find things in there that you'll recognize. I'll put a link to the lyrics as well, so you can have a look at those. And that's got a lot of these si imperfect conditional sentences in it. Not so much of the others because they're less common, but the second conditional type is used a lot in this song. So go and listen to that and look at the lyrics if you want to do something a little bit more exciting. So as usual, that is it for this video. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. I know there's a lot to learn with this, but remember, it's not really that difficult. It's just there's a lot to it, okay? So if you have any questions, do ask. Put in a comment on here. You can also message me, you can send me an email, you can contact me through Instagram if you like, because I'm now on Instagram. That's a thing. And remember, I'm planning an FAQ video soon. So if you have any questions about French or life in France, then do go ahead and ask. And after that incredibly long outro, I will say à bientôt.